Well, friends, a lot has changed in the last few weeks, but it turns out I haven't changed nearly as much as I thought. See, despite barely going anywhere ever and using way less stuff than usual, I'm still losing things every single day. Part of why I picked one of the books I picked for our May book club, Liturgy of the Ordinary, is that it has a chapter on losing your keys, that it ties to the liturgy of confession, to facing the truth about yourself. And this is the truth about myself. This week there was a point where I needed my shoes, my car keys, and my wallet all at the same time, and I could find not a single one of those things, despite the fact that they were all within about 10 feet of each other and me. I frequently can't find things even when they are right under my nose. And so I say that to say that I relate pretty well to the disciples in our story today and in most of our stories of the disciples. We sometimes like to give the disciples a really hard time for their failures and shortcomings. We chuckle at their petty fights over who's the greatest one and roll our eyes at their request to call down fire on their enemies. We have forever enshrined poor Thomas as doubting Thomas, and Peter as the denier, and James and John as the guys who slept through the transfiguration. And we'd like to think that had we walked with Jesus in real life, in the flesh, we would have gotten it right the first time, or at least the second. We would have understood, and we would have known what was going on. And so it's tempting for us to have the same reaction when we read this text from the Gospel of John this morning, which is a portion of what is called Jesus' farewell discourses. And they go from John 14 to John 16 in that gospel. And so after many months of being with Jesus, the disciples are sharing a meal with their friend who, to their dismay, is talking about his impending death. And when Jesus tries to comfort them in their fear and in their misunderstanding, they just demand to know more information about what's going to happen. See, they don't want Jesus's comforts. They just want to know more things. They want to know what the future holds. Thomas wants to know the way to the Father's house, and Philip wants to know how to see God. And Jesus responds, after all this time, you still don't know who I am. Even if you and I are maybe not so confident in what great disciples we would be, I suspect that we all hope we'd recognize an encounter with God when it's staring us in the face. But maybe not. I wonder how often we ignore God who is right under our noses, right in front of us. How often do we miss God's presence in the very places Jesus said we'd find it? In bread and wine, in water and scripture and friendship, among our neighbors at the margins. How often do we let our own ideas about what God ought to look like and what God ought to do keep us from getting involved in where God is actually already moving? Like the first disciples, we have a bad habit of getting so bogged down in our quest to learn about God that we miss God's very self when God shows up in ordinary and everyday things. There could be no more important quest for us right now than to come to know God in new ways. Not to learn more about God, but to come to know God in new ways and to encounter God in new ways. Now that we can't do anything the way that we used to do, and we can't necessarily go to meet God where we're used to doing that. And so in our gospel lesson today, Jesus offers us a really helpful corrective. He reminds Thomas that faith isn't knowing about the way. Faith is knowing the way, and Jesus is the way. He reminds Philip that faith isn't knowing about God. Faith is knowing God. And that truth is not a proposition, truth is a person. And that person doesn't always show up in the ways we expect, in our lives or in the lives of other people. So we best keep our hearts open to the ways God might show up around us, which is hard because mostly we would just prefer to know which way to go. Just tell us which way to go, tell us what's going to happen. We'd rather just know about truth. But Jesus says no. The way of life is to know Jesus and to see Jesus in all the places he said he'd be, in one another, in the poor, at the table. Now, John 14:6, from the passage we read, the part where it says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except by me, has become a go-to for discussions about who gets saved and who doesn't, and who's in and who's out. And it can be a real clobber verse. But anytime that happens, it's pulling that text way out of its context. We don't have time to say much about it today, except to mention that it's worth keeping in mind that these words were spoken in an intimate setting among Jesus' closest disciples. So we should be really careful about interpreting them as applying only to those who believe differently than we do. Almost any time I read any scripture, if I start to read it as applying to other people and not to me, I know that I have a problem, and that could be no more important than in this text. Jesus is talking to his closest people. And when we find Jesus describing judgment, Jesus just never gives us the image of himself standing with his arms folded at the gate of the kingdom of heaven, declaring, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one's getting in here except through me. When Jesus describes judgment, he says, I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't welcome me. I needed clothes, and you didn't clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't visit me. In other words, friends, I was right under your nose, and you missed it. Thanks. So with this in mind, it's a relief to see how patient Jesus was with his disciples in their continuous getting it wrong. Even after they missed out and misunderstood over and over again, Jesus kept showing up, offering grace and giving them another chance and even another teaching. And eventually the disciples went from this sort of ragtag bunch of guys who could barely keep up to a group of disciples who were bold and wise and courageous, confident in preaching their message and building communities of faith. And I wonder if it's because they finally made the shift from needing to know about God to knowing God, from searching and striving to receive the gifts of God and putting them to use. A couple of years ago, I was on a spiritual formation retreat that had as one of its chief underpinnings this idea that information doesn't transform us. And as a lifelong student, I have to tell you that I scoffed at that at the beginning of the retreat because I really believe in the value of having good information, but I had to start admitting the truth of that. And it continues to stick with me every time I think that information is going to change me. You see, I thought at the beginning of this pandemic as this virus was making its way into our community, and I was so anxious and frightened that I thought surely, just like everything else, if I just learned more about it, I wouldn't be so afraid of it. This has always been my go-to approach. When I was a little girl growing up in North Texas who became paralyzed with fear when I heard that beep, beep, beep sound that was a weather warning on the TV, I learned everything I could about how storms worked and when tornadoes form and how to be safe from them. And that's how I learned not to be terrified of the beeping. And so I pretty much used the same approach. And so, like a lot of us, when all of this began, I read everything I could to become my best armchair epidemiologist. But it just really didn't work this time. In fact, when I thought about it, I realized it hardly ever works. I still don't actually like the beeping of a weather warning. It still scares me to this day. And so it turns out that if information actually transformed us, we wouldn't still be so stuck on the same anxieties and insecurities that we've had since we were children. We'd also be able to change our minds when we took in new information. When all the studies we're doing now about the intractable state of our politics that are being impressively showcased by a partisan divide over how a virus works, all of those studies show us that that's not what happens. That now when we learn a new fact that contradicts our opinion, we just double down on our opinion instead of absorbing the new fact. And a study that has fascinated me for years concluded that your doctor can sit in front of you and tell you all the things that are making you unhealthy. He can tell you that if you don't change your diet, your behavior, your habits, whatever it is, that behavior will literally kill you. You still won't change it. Information doesn't transform us. So what finally helped me move forward in this quarantine season is first, great mental health care. I am so fortunate to have access to a therapist and a doctor who takes seriously my mental health and help me manage my anxiety. And I don't want to ever miss a chance to tell you, especially now, that if you are in need of that kind of care, I will gladly be a person to help you find what you need. Because what has helped me is having that support to be able to take a step back, reflect on new realities, figure out what about them I can control and what I can't, to begin to think differently about what normal means, and to look at all the good that is around me, not in some pie-in-the-sky way that ignores what's really terrible about this time, but that takes all of it as hard about this season seriously, but in the context of a bigger and a more hopeful story about who I am, about who we are as a community, about how people are in the world, and about how God is at work in God's creation. What transforms us is a reflective life, one that can take enough of a breath to see God on the move, one that examines our motives and what we believe is true, one that listens to the Holy Spirit. Knowing Jesus, not just knowing about Jesus, is what transforms us. It's what transformed those first disciples. Instead of just trying to learn more about Jesus, they realized it was better to know Jesus. I wonder if their vision shifted and they could see God at work in new ways in their communities. I wonder if their prayers shifted, and instead of asking to be able God to bless what they were already doing, they asked God to show them what was right in front of them. I wonder what it would be like for us, friends, to spend this week looking closely for where God might be on the move in the world around us. I wonder if you could see Jesus in the faces of your loved ones, or in the spring flowers and sunshine, or even in your enemies, or in the people who are working together for good in the world right now. I wonder if you could see Jesus in the face of the poor, of the oppressed, of the stranger, of the sick, and of those trying desperately to heal them. I wonder if we might find that God, the very one for whom we have searched and sought, is right under our nose. The preacher Barbara Brown Taylor says that no one longs for what he or she already has, and yet the insight about people wise about the spiritual life suggests that the reason so many of us can't see the red X that marks the spot is because we're standing on it. All we lack is the willingness to imagine that we already have everything we need. And what could be better news, friends, for people stuck at home, who can't gather together in our worship space, who can't do the things we usually do to meet God, to know that we can meet God right in the place that we are standing. What you're looking for might be just under your nose, friends. Don't miss it. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.